deep in the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, where cell towers fear to reach and neighbors are separated by miles of dense forest. 16-year-old Tommy Brennan worked his family's failing farm with calloused hands and an empty stomach. The year was 1983, and the Brennan family hadn't seen prosperity in generations, just endless cycles of broken equipment, failed crops, and mounting debt that threatened to swallow their ancestral land whole. When a well-dressed stranger's wagon broke down on the old mountain road that autumn day, most folks would have kept walking. The Brennans barely had enough to feed themselves, let alone help outsiders. But Tommy saw something in the man's desperate eyes, something that reminded him of his own father's quiet desperation. So he spent his last few dollars on materials and worked through the night, repairing that wooden wheel with the same care his grandfather had taught him. The stranger thanked him with tears in his eyes and disappeared into the morning mist, promising he'd never forget the kindness. Tommy never expected to see him again. He was wrong. But what brought this man back after 40 years, and why is his gift about to turn Tommy's world completely upside down? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Tommy's boots squelched through the mud as he made his way down to the main road, the October morning air sharp against his face. He'd been heading to check the old fence posts when he spotted the peculiar sight ahead, a horse-drawn wagon tilted at an awkward angle, its left rear wheel splintered and useless. The wagon itself seemed oddly out of place. While horse-drawn transport wasn't entirely uncommon in these remote mountains, this particular rig appeared expensive, well-crafted, with brass fittings that caught the early sunlight. The horse, a magnificent chestnut mare, stood patiently in her traces, occasionally pawing the ground with obvious anxiety. Beside the disabled wagon stood a man unlike anyone Tommy had seen traverse these backwoods roads. Despite the morning chill, sweat beaded on the stranger's forehead as he crouched beside the broken wheel, his fine wool coat and polished leather boots marking him as someone from the outside world, the world beyond these ancient hills where the Brennan family had scraped out their existence for 4 generations. "Morning," Tommy called out, approaching cautiously. Mountain folk learned early to be wary of strangers, but his mother's voice echoed in his memory. "We help those who need helping, Thomas. That's what decent people do." The man looked up, startled. He appeared to be in his 40s, with graying temples and worry lines etched deep around his eyes. "Oh, hello there, son. I don't suppose you know anyone around these parts who might—" He gestured helplessly at the destroyed wheel. "I'm afraid I'm not much use with repairs." Tommy knelt beside the wheel, running his fingers along the splintered spokes. The damage was extensive. 3 spokes completely snapped, the rim cracked in 2 places. It would take more than simple patching to make this roadworthy again. "What's your destination?" Tommy asked, already calculating the work involved. "There's a mining operation about 20 miles north. I have important business there." The man's voice carried an urgency that went beyond mere inconvenience. "I was told this back road would be faster than the main highway, but—" He shook his head ruefully. Tommy stood, wiping his hands on his worn jeans. 20 miles north would take the man through some of the most isolated terrain in the county. No place to be stranded, especially with weather turning cold and unpredictable. "I can fix this," Tommy said quietly. "But it'll take most of the day, maybe into the night. And I'll need to buy some materials from Henderson's store down the mountain." The stranger's face brightened with hope. "I can pay you, of course. Would $50 be sufficient?" Tommy's breath caught. $50 represented more money than the Brennan family had seen in a single transaction in months. But he shook his head. "Don't have that much cash on me for materials. I've got about $12. That should cover what we need. Please, let me give you the money for supplies." "No, sir." Tommy's voice carried the quiet dignity his grandfather had instilled in him. "I said I'd help, and I will. Just need to walk down to Henderson's and back." The stranger watched in amazement as Tommy headed down the mountain road, his thin frame disappearing into the morning shadows between the trees. Here was a boy who clearly had little to spare, offering help to a complete stranger without expectation of significant reward. As the day wore on, Tommy worked steadily, his hands moving with the practiced precision of someone raised to fix what was broken and make do with what was available. The stranger sat quietly on a fallen log, occasionally offering to help but mostly just watching this young mountain craftsman restore his wagon wheel with nothing more than basic tools, determination, and an inherited understanding of how things were meant to fit together. The rain had started before dawn, turning the mountain paths into ribbons of mud that clung to Thomas's worn boots like desperate fingers. He pulled his threadbare jacket tighter as he made his way down the winding trail toward the main road, the same route he'd taken every morning for the past 3 years since starting high school in the valley below. The bus stop was nothing more than a weathered wooden post beside the narrow highway marked by decades of initials carved by bored students. Thomas stamped his feet against the cold, watching his breath form small clouds in the crisp October air. The mountains around him blazed with autumn colors, though the beauty was lost on him this morning as he worried about the algebra test he hadn't studied for and the lunch money he didn't have. Steam rose from the crumpled hood as Thomas ran toward the wreckage. The driver's side door had buckled inward, trapping whoever was inside. Through the spider-webbed windshield, he could see movement, a man in an expensive suit, blood trickling down his forehead, struggling to free himself from the twisted steering wheel. "Don't move!" Thomas called out, though he wasn't sure why. He'd seen enough hunting accidents to know that moving too quickly after a crash could make things worse. The man's eyes found his through the broken glass, pale blue eyes that seemed oddly calm despite the circumstances. "My briefcase," the man said, his voice strained but clear. "In the back seat, please." Thomas hesitated. His mother had always warned him about getting involved with strangers, especially rich folks from the city who sometimes used these mountain roads as shortcuts. But the man was bleeding, and the smell of gasoline was growing stronger. He managed to pry open the rear door, which groaned in protest. The leather interior was littered with broken glass and scattered papers. A brown leather briefcase lay on its side behind the passenger seat, its contents spilled across the floor. Thomas gathered up what he could see, documents, photographs, what looked like legal papers, and stuffed them back inside before grabbing the case. The sound of approaching sirens echoed off the mountain walls. Someone in one of the houses below must have heard the crash and called for help. Thomas returned to the driver's side window, briefcase in hand. "The ambulance is coming," he said. "You're going to be okay." The man studied Thomas's face with those unsettling blue eyes. "What's your name, son?" "Thomas. Thomas Mackenzie." "Thomas Mackenzie," the man repeated, as if committing it to memory. "You live around here?" Thomas nodded toward the mountain behind them. "Up the ridge, about 2 miles. The wail of sirens grew louder. The man reached into his jacket pocket with obvious difficulty and pulled out a gold watch, its chain glinting despite the overcast sky. "Take this," he said, pressing it against the window, "as a thank you." "I can't take that, mister. I just—" "Please." The man's voice carried an urgency that had nothing to do with his injuries. "It means more than you know that someone like you still exists in this world." Before Thomas could protest further, the ambulance rounded the curve, followed by a fire truck and police cruiser. The next 30 minutes passed in a blur of questions, flashing lights and official forms. Thomas gave his statement to a state trooper who looked skeptical that a kid from the mountains had managed to retrieve anything useful from the wreck. The man, who the paramedics addressed as Mr. Westbrook, was conscious and talking as they loaded him into the ambulance. He caught Thomas's eye one last time before the doors closed, and there was something in his expression that seemed almost like recognition, though Thomas was certain they'd never met before. As the emergency vehicles disappeared around the bend, Thomas realized he was still holding the briefcase. The trooper had been too busy with his paperwork to notice, and now Thomas wasn't sure what to do with it. He looked down at the gold watch in his other hand, its weight surprising him. The inscription on the back read, "R.W. Time reveals all truths." 1952. The sound of the school bus approaching made the decision for him. Thomas slipped the watch into his pocket and hefted the briefcase. He'd figure out how to return it to Mr. Westbrook later, once he learned which hospital they'd taken him to. He had no way of knowing that this simple act of kindness would set in motion a chain of events that would still be unfolding 40 years later, or that the contents of that briefcase would one day make him one of the wealthiest men in 3 states. The stranger's weathered hands trembled slightly as he reached into his worn leather satchel. Thomas watched, mesmerized, as those fingers, stained with what looked like decades of honest work, withdrew a small wooden box, no larger than a jewelry case but crafted with extraordinary care. The wood gleamed despite its age, revealing intricate patterns carved along its edges. 41 years, the man said, his voice barely above a whisper. 41 years I've carried this, waiting for the right moment to return it. Thomas felt his breath catch. Something about the box stirred a memory so distant it felt like trying to grasp smoke. The craftsmanship was unlike anything he'd seen, yet familiar in a way that made his chest tighten with inexplicable emotion. "I don't understand," Thomas managed. "Return what?" "I've never seen that before in my life." The nickname hit him like a physical blow. Nobody had called him Tom in over 3 decades. His mother had been the last, her voice echoing through their tiny mountain cabin as she called him in for supper. But she'd been gone for 15 years, and those memories belonged to a different lifetime, when he was just a boy scraping by in the hollows of Appalachia. Against his better judgment, Thomas leaned forward. The box seemed to pulse with its own warmth, and as his eyes traced the carved patterns, recognition dawned like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. Those weren't random decorations, they were initials, worked into the design so subtly that only someone who knew what to look for would notice them. T.M. Thomas Mitchell. His own initials, carved in the careful, painstaking style of someone who'd never had proper tools but possessed infinite patience. The memory crashed over him with stunning clarity, his 12-year-old hands raw from the cold, working by candlelight with his grandfather's old whittling knife. He'd spent 3 months on that box, every spare moment when he wasn't helping with chores or walking the 6 miles to the one-room schoolhouse. "Dear God," he whispered, "but that's impossible. I gave it away. I gave it to—" A rich boy who was crying by the river because his father had been mean to him again. The stranger's voice carried the weight of decades, a boy who had everything but felt like he had nothing. "You gave me your most precious possession because you thought I needed it more than you did." Thomas's legs gave out, and he sank onto his pristine sofa, designer fabric suddenly feeling as foreign as silk pajamas had felt on his scrawny 12-year-old frame. The memories flooded back now, unstoppable as spring meltwater down the mountain. He'd been fishing that day, hoping to catch something for dinner since the cupboards were bare again. But instead of trout, he'd found a boy about his own age, dressed in clothes that cost more than Thomas's family spent on food in a month, sobbing like his heart was broken. The boy had been staying at one of the fancy resort lodges up the mountain, where rich families came to play at roughing it for a week or 2. Thomas had tried to comfort him, and eventually the story came out. The boy's father was a demanding, cruel man who seemed to take pleasure in belittling his son. Nothing was ever good enough. The boy felt worthless, unwanted, like a disappointment in expensive clothes. So Thomas had given him the box. The wooden box he'd been carving as a Christmas present for his mother, the only gift he'd be able to afford that year. He'd pressed it into the rich boy's hands and told him to keep his treasures in it, the things that mattered most, so he'd never forget that he was worth something. "David," Thomas breathed, and suddenly he could see past the grey hair and lined face to the features of the boy he'd once comforted. David Hartwell. "Took you long enough," David said with a smile that transformed his entire face. "Though I suppose I've changed a bit more than my pictures in Forbes magazine might suggest." Forbes magazine. Thomas's mind reeled as pieces clicked into place. David Hartwell. Not just any David Hartwell, but the David Hartwell, the tech mogul, the philanthropist, one of the wealthiest men in America. The boy who'd been crying by a mountain stream had become someone whose name was spoken in boardrooms around the world. "I don't understand," Thomas said again, though he was beginning to. "Why now? Why are you here?" David's expression grew serious as he placed the wooden box on the glass coffee table between them. "Because I've spent 41 years learning what treasure really means, and because I finally figured out how to repay a debt that's been growing interest in my heart since 1983. The box sat between them like a bridge across decades, connecting two boys who'd shared a moment of pure human kindness with the men they'd become. The stranger's words hung in the air like morning mist over the mountains. Thomas felt his chest tighten as memories he'd buried for decades began clawing their way to the surface. The sandwich, the little girl with the torn coat, the way she'd looked back at him with those enormous brown eyes before disappearing forever into the crowd at the bus station. "I don't understand," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper. "That was 37 years ago. She was just a child, maybe 8 or 9 years old." Elena smiled, and in that expression, Thomas caught a fleeting glimpse of something familiar. A warmth, a particular way her eyes crinkled at the corners that sent another wave of recognition through him. "She was 8, Elena confirmed, and she never forgot the boy who gave up his lunch for a stranger. She told that story her entire life." Elena paused, her composure wavering slightly. "I'm not just here representing her, Thomas. I'm here because Maria Esperanza Santos was my grandmother." "Your grandmother," he repeated slowly. "But how did you find me?" Elena reached into her briefcase and withdrew a manila folder. "After Abuela died last spring, we found this among her papers." She opened the folder to reveal yellowed newspaper clippings, handwritten notes, and a faded Polaroid photograph. "She spent years trying to track you down. The problem was, she only knew your first name and that you lived in these mountains. It wasn't much to go on." Thomas stared at the photograph Elena held out to him. It was a picture of the old bus station, taken from across the street. The image was grainy, but he could make out the bench where he'd sat that day, the spot where his life had taken an unexpected turn. "She went back there," Elena continued, "years later, hoping to find someone who remembered you. The station manager told her about a boy from the mountains who sometimes came to town with his mother for supplies. Said you always carried yourself like you were older than your years, always polite, always helping others." Sarah pushed through the screen door, unable to stay silent any longer. "Thomas, what is she talking about? What sandwich?" Thomas looked up at his wife, seeing the confusion and curiosity in her face. In all their years together, through all their late-night conversations and shared memories, he'd never told her about that day. It seemed too small, too insignificant to mention. Just a moment of childhood compassion that had faded into the background of his life. "It was nothing, really," he began, but Elena interrupted. It wasn't nothing to her. Her voice carried a fierce conviction. That sandwich kept her alive. She and her mother were fleeing an abusive situation. They had no money, no food, and nowhere to go. They were heading to a women's shelter 3 towns over, but the bus was delayed for hours. My grandmother was weak from hunger, scared, and convinced the world was a cruel place where no one cared about a little girl and her desperate mother." Elena's eyes glistened as she continued. "Then this boy, not much older than she was, walked up and handed her half his sandwich. No questions, no conditions, just kindness from a stranger. She said it was the first time she realized there might be good people in the world after all." Thomas felt Sarah's hand rest gently on his shoulder as the memory crystallized with painful clarity. The girl's thin frame, her mother's worn face, the way they'd both looked so lost and afraid. He remembered the moment of decision, wondering if he should get involved, then simply acting on instinct. "She made it to the shelter," Elena said. "My grandmother and her mother started over. Abuela worked hard, got an education, became a teacher. She married my grandfather when she was 22, had 4 children, including my mother. Our family owes everything to that moment of kindness." Thomas opened his mouth to protest that he'd done nothing special, but Elena raised her hand. "Let me finish. Abuela died at 94, surrounded by her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren in her final weeks, she made me promise to find you. She wanted you to know what your kindness had created. Elena gestured toward the envelope. What's in there isn't just money, Thomas. It's gratitude. It's the physical representation of a life well lived because one person chose compassion over indifference. The mountain air seemed thinner suddenly, filled with the weight of decades and the mysterious ways that single moments could echo across time. Thomas looked down at the envelope, then back at Elena's earnest face, and began to understand that this day would divide his life into before and after, just as surely as that long-ago afternoon at the bus station had done for a frightened little girl named Maria. The stranger's words hung in the mountain air like morning mist, thick with implications Marcus couldn't quite grasp. He studied the man's weathered face, searching for some hint of deception, but found only a peculiar mixture of sadness and determination etched in those deep-set eyes. "I think you have me confused with someone else," Marcus said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm nobody special. Just a guy trying to keep his family's land from being sold off piece by piece." The stranger reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small, tarnished object. When he opened his palm, Marcus felt the ground shift beneath his feet. There, gleaming dully in the afternoon light, was a brass compass, the same one he'd given to a lost hiker 37 years ago. "You dropped this," the stranger said, echoing the exact words Marcus had spoken to a frightened 10-year-old boy on a fog-shrouded trail in 1983. Though I suppose it was more of a gift than a retrieval. Marcus's knees nearly buckled. The memory came flooding back with startling clarity. A small boy with tear-streaked cheeks, designer hiking boots too big for his feet, and eyes wide with terror as the mountain fog rolled in. The child had been separated from what Marcus assumed was a family camping trip, though he'd never seen hide nor hair of any adults searching for the boy. "You," Marcus breathed, reaching out tentatively to touch the compass, his grandfather's compass, the one he'd inherited when he was barely older than the lost child had been. "But you were just a kid." "David Chen," the stranger said, extending his free hand. "Though back then I would have answered to, 'Hey you,' or that scared little city boy who had no business being on a mountain." Marcus shook the offered hand, his mind reeling. "I remember you were wearing this fancy outdoor gear that looked like it came straight from a catalogue. Your parents must have been worried sick." David's expression darkened. There were no parents on that trip, just me, a court-appointed guardian who was more interested in his bourbon than keeping track of his ward, and a group of other foster kids who thought it would be funny to see how far the Asian boy would follow them before he got lost. The casual cruelty in David's voice made Marcus wince. He remembered now how the boy had flinched when Marcus first approached, as if expecting another trick or abandonment. It had taken nearly 20 minutes of patient conversation before the child trusted him enough to follow him down the mountain. "I gave you that compass because you were scared the fog would come back," Marcus said slowly. "You kept looking over your shoulder like you expected to get lost again." "I carried it everywhere for years," David replied, turning the compass over in his palm. "Every time I moved to a new foster home, and there were many, this went with me. It was the first thing anyone had ever given me just because they wanted to help." Marcus felt a flush of embarrassment. "It wasn't that big a deal. You needed it more than I did. You have no idea what you did for me that day." David's voice carried an intensity that made Marcus step back involuntarily. "Do you know what it's like to be 10 years old and believe that every adult in your life sees you as nothing more than an inconvenience, a problem to be managed or ignored?" The question hung between them, heavy with old pain. Marcus thought about his own childhood, not wealthy by any means, but rich with the steady presence of his grandfather, the security of knowing this mountain would always be home. "After that day, I started to believe that maybe kindness existed in the world," David continued. "Maybe some people helped others without expecting anything in return. That compass became my proof that goodness was real, even when everything else in my life suggested otherwise." Marcus looked down at his calloused hands, uncomfortable with the weight of David's gratitude. What happened to your guardian? The other kids? The guardian lost his license after that trip when the state found out he'd been drinking. The other kids? David shrugged. We all went our separate ways into the system. I never saw most of them again. And you ended up okay? David smiled, and for the first time, it reached his eyes. Better than okay. Full scholarship to MIT, graduated summa cum laude, started a technology company that went public when I was 28. I've spent the last 15 years building something that matters, something that helps people. Sounds like you did that all on your own. Maybe, but every time I faced a setback or wanted to give up, I'd hold that compass and remember that somewhere in the world was a stranger who'd shown me kindness for no reason other than it was the right thing to do. That memory carried me through more dark nights than you'll ever know. The leather journal felt warm against Thomas's palms as he opened it in the lamplight of his kitchen. The pages were yellowed with age, filled with his own handwriting from decades past, entries he'd forgotten, thoughts of a young man trying to make sense of his place in the world. September 15th, 1983, found a man hurt bad up on Eagles Ridge today. Foreign fellow, spoke with an accent I couldn't place. Gave him what little I had, some water, my lunch, helped get him down the mountain to Doc Peterson's. He kept saying something about remembering kindness. Strange thing was, he had this look in his eyes like he was seeing something I couldn't. Hope he makes it through whatever trouble brought him up there. Thomas's breath caught. He remembered that day now. The man with the expensive clothes torn and bloodied, the way he'd gripped Thomas's hand with surprising strength despite his injuries. What he didn't remember was writing about it, or the man's accent, or the peculiar intensity in his gaze. He flipped through more pages, finding other entries he'd completely forgotten. Stories of small kindnesses, moments of connection with strangers passing through their remote mountain town. A pattern began to emerge that made his skin prickle with unease. "Dad?" Sarah's voice came from the living room. "Everything okay in there?" "Fine, sweetheart," he called back, though his voice sounded strained even to his own ears. He turned the page and froze. October 3rd, 1983. The foreign man came by today, said his name was Victor, something I couldn't pronounce. He's healed up remarkable fast. Wanted to thank me again, said he had to leave but that he'd never forget what I did. Tried to give me money but I wouldn't take it. He smiled at that, said someday he'd find a way to repay the kindness. The way he said it felt like a promise that went deeper than just words. Thomas closed the journal and stared at the wall, his mind racing. Victor. The man at the funeral had introduced himself as Victor Novak. After 40 years he'd come back. But why now? And how had he known about the cancer before anyone else? The sound of Sarah's laptop closing in the next room reminded him of their earlier conversation. She'd been trying to research Victor online, and Thomas realized he should see what she'd found. He tucked the journal under his arm and walked into the living room. "Any luck?" he asked, settling into his old recliner. Sarah looked up from her laptop with troubled eyes. "That's just it, Dad. I can't find anything about a Victor Novak that matches the man we met. There are several people with that name, but none of them fit. No international businessmen, no one with obvious wealth. It's like he doesn't exist in any official capacity." Thomas nodded slowly. "Found something myself." He handed her the journal, opened to the first entry about Victor. "Read this." Sarah's eyes widened as she scanned the pages. "Dad, you never told me about this. You helped this man 40 years ago?" "I'd forgotten until just now. We used to get drifters and hikers through here all the time, especially ones who got in over their heads on the mountain trails. But Victor—" Thomas paused, trying to capture the memory that felt both distant and suddenly vivid. He was different, not just because of his clothes or the way he talked. There was something about him that made you think he'd seen more of the world than most people could imagine. And now he's back. Sarah flipped through more pages of the journal. "Dad, some of these entries, did you really help this many people over the years?" Thomas shrugged. "Was just being neighborly, way I was raised. But look at this pattern. You've got entries about helping at least a dozen strangers over just a few months in 1983. A woman whose car broke down and you fixed it for free. A family whose camping gear got stolen and you gave them supplies. An old man who got lost and you spent 2 days helping him find his way back to the main road. Sarah looked up at him with something approaching awe. You never talked about any of this. Didn't seem worth mentioning. Just did what anyone would do. No, Dad, this isn't what just anyone would do. This is, she gestured at the journal, this is someone who made kindness a way of life. Before Thomas could respond, headlights swept across the front window. A car was pulling into their driveway, its engine purring with the quiet efficiency of expensive machinery. "Expecting anyone?" Sarah asked. Thomas stood and peered through the curtain. A black sedan sat in their gravel driveway, its driver still behind the wheel. As they watched, the rear door opened and Victor Novak stepped out, straightening his coat against the mountain evening chill. "It's him," Thomas whispered. Victor walked slowly toward their front door, carrying a small wooden box in his hands. He moved with the careful precision of someone who understood the weight of the moment, each step deliberate and measured. The knock, when it came, was gentle but firm. The morning air carried the scent of pine and dew as Marcus made his way down the familiar mountain path, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp October air. 40 years had passed since he'd last walked this trail, yet every stone, every bend seemed etched into his memory with startling clarity. The weight of Daniel's journal pressed against his chest through his jacket pocket, a constant reminder of why he'd returned to these forgotten hills. The old cabin appeared through the trees like a ghost from another time. Weather-beaten boards had turned silver grey, and the roof sagged under decades of harsh mountain winters. Vines claimed the chimney, and the front steps had partially collapsed, leaving jagged wooden teeth jutting from the foundation. Marcus stood frozen, watching the structure that had once been his entire world. "Well, I'll be damned," the old man said, his voice carrying the same gentle warmth Marcus remembered. "Marcus Whitfield. Hello, Pa." Marcus's voice cracked slightly on the familiar word. They stood looking at each other across the yard, two men separated by time and choices, connected by blood and shared hardship. Pa had aged more than Marcus expected, his frame thinner, his movements slower, but his eyes held the same quiet intelligence that had guided Marcus through his childhood. "Heard you might be coming back," Pa said, stepping closer. "Word travels fast up here, even when folks try to keep it quiet." Marcus nodded, unsure how to bridge the gap between them. "I should have come sooner." "Should've, could've." Pa waved a dismissive hand. "You're here now. That's what matters." He gestured toward the cabin. "Place ain't much to look at anymore, but the coffee's still strong." Inside, the cabin felt smaller than Marcus remembered, but everything remained exactly as he'd left it. The same table where he'd done his homework by lamplight, the same wood stove that had kept them warm through countless winters. Even his old chair sat in the corner, now serving as a catch-all for Pa's reading materials. Pa busied himself with the coffee, moving around the tiny kitchen with practiced efficiency. "Heard you did well for yourself down in the valley." "Real well. I was lucky," Marcus said, settling into his old chair. The wood creaked familiarly under his weight. "Luck's what you make of it." Pa poured 2 cups of coffee, black and strong enough to wake the dead. "That rich boy you helped all those years ago, he tracked you down, didn't he?" Marcus nearly dropped his cup. "How did you—" "Marcus, son, I may be old, but I ain't stupid. Stranger shows up asking questions about you, mentions something about a debt from 40 years back." Pa's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Figured it had to be connected to that fancy car you helped push out of the snow. Only time I ever saw you come home with a smile that big in the middle of winter." The memory washed over Marcus with unexpected intensity. He'd been 17, trudging home through a blizzard when he'd found Daniel's car stuck in a drift on the mountain road. The young man behind the wheel had been dressed in expensive clothes, clearly lost and frightened. Marcus had spent 2 hours digging the car out and pushing it to safety, refusing the money Daniel had offered. "He died," Marcus said quietly. "Daniel. Just a few months ago." Pa's expression softened. "I'm sorry to hear that. He seemed like good people from what little I saw." He left me something, a letter and... Marcus hesitated, then pulled out Daniel's journal. This. Pa set down his coffee and examined the leather-bound book with reverence. Looks important. It is. Daniel wrote about that night, about what it meant to him. But there's more. Marcus opened to a page near the back, where Daniel's handwriting became more urgent. He mentioned something he left behind that night, something he couldn't come back for. Pa's eyebrows rose. Left behind? Here? Marcus nodded. According to this, he hid something before the storm hit, somewhere on our property. He looked up at his father. I was hoping you might remember something, anything unusual from that time. Pa stroked his beard thoughtfully. 40 years is a long time, son. But now that you mention it, he stood slowly and walked to the window overlooking the back of the property. Few weeks after that storm, I found some disturbed ground near the old well. Figured an animal had been digging, but the hole was too neat, too purposeful. Marcus joined him at the window, following his gaze toward a stone structure barely visible through the overgrown brush. Never thought much about it until now, Pa continued. But if someone wanted to hide something and mark the spot, the well would be the perfect landmark, Marcus finished. The leather journal felt warm against Sarah's palms as she opened it carefully, the aged binding creaking softly in the quiet of her living room. Marcus sat across from her, his weathered hands folded, watching her face with an expression she couldn't quite read. The first page bore her father's familiar handwriting, the ink slightly faded but still legible. October 15th, 1983. Met a boy today who reminded me why I started this work in the first place. Her breath caught. That was the day after the landslide, the day her father had left their cabin before dawn and returned well past midnight, his clothes muddy and his face drawn with exhaustion. She'd been 8 years old, worried sick, pressing her nose against the window until she saw his familiar silhouette trudging up the mountain path. Sarah glanced up at Marcus, seeing those same eyes now lined with decades of experience, still holding that unwavering compassion her father had recognized all those years ago. I've been documenting the geological instabilities in this region for 3 years now, sending reports to the state that get buried in bureaucratic red tape. Today I watched a child do what our government won't, take responsibility for the people who live in the shadow of these mountains. He found Mrs. Murphy's cat, trapped but alive in a pocket of debris. The way his face lit up when that cat meowed. It reminded me that this isn't about rock formations and soil samples. It's about the Marcus Chens of the world, and making sure they don't have to dig through rubble to save their neighbors. The pages that followed detailed her father's research with a newfound urgency. Technical diagrams of fault lines and water tables were interspersed with personal observations about the families who lived in the most vulnerable areas. He'd mapped not just the geology, but the human geography, who lived where, who couldn't afford to move, who would need the most help when the next disaster struck. November 3rd, 1983, saw Marcus again today. He was helping old Mr. Kowalski repair his roof before the winter snows. That boy has taken it upon himself to be the neighborhood guardian angel. I asked him about school, about his future. He wants to be a doctor, wants to help people, smart as a whip, but his family can barely keep food on the table. There has to be something I can do. Sarah turned the page and found a folded envelope tucked between the journal's leaves. Her name was written on it in her father's careful script, but beneath it, in different ink, was a note to be opened only in the presence of Marcus Chen. Her hands trembling slightly, she broke the seal. Inside was a cashier's check made out to her, dated just 2 weeks before her father's death, for an amount that made her gasp. Beneath it was a letter. My dearest Sarah, if you're reading this, then Marcus has found you, and the time has come for you to understand what your old dad was really up to all those years. The money comes from a foundation I established in secret, funded by the patent royalties from my seismic monitoring equipment. I never told you because I wanted you to make your own way in the world, to understand the value of struggle and perseverance. But now there's work to be done that requires resources, and it's time for the Chen Foundation to fulfill its true purpose. Sarah looked up at Marcus, who was watching her with a knowing smile. Chen Foundation? Your father insisted on the name, Marcus said quietly. Said a poor mountain boy who dug through rubble with his bare hands deserved to have his name on something permanent. I tried to argue, but you know how stubborn he could be. She laughed, despite the tears streaming down her face. Yes, I do. The Foundation's mission is simple: to protect mountain communities by providing early warning systems, emergency response training, and relocation assistance when necessary. But more than that, it's meant to support people like Marcus, young people who see a problem and refuse to accept that nothing can be done. You have your father's engineering mind and your mother's compassionate heart. Together, you and Marcus can build something that will save lives for generations to come. Sarah closed the journal, understanding flooding through her like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Her father's mysterious late-night trips, his secretive phone calls, his insistence that she study environmental engineering. It had all been leading to this moment. How long have you known? She asked Marcus. About the Foundation? Since I was 18, when your father paid for my medical school education. About you being his daughter? Marcus smiled. Since the moment you opened your door and I saw his eyes looking back at me. The old pickup truck rattled down the mountain road, its headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, his knuckles white against the worn leather. Beside him, Elena sat in contemplative silence, the manila envelope resting on her lap like a sleeping cat she was afraid to disturb. You don't have to do this, she said finally, her voice barely audible over the engine's rumble. Marcus glanced at her, noting the worry lines that had deepened around her eyes since the stranger's visit. Yes, I do. Whatever's in that envelope, whatever Thomas Chen discovered about that day, I need to know. The cemetery appeared around the next bend, its wrought iron gates standing open as if expecting their arrival. Marcus had called ahead to the groundskeeper, an old family friend who'd agreed to meet them after hours. Some conversations, Marcus understood instinctively, required the kind of privacy that only the dead could provide. They parked near the entrance and walked in silence past weathered headstones and elaborate monuments. The Chen family plot occupied a modest corner beneath an ancient oak tree, its branches forming a natural canopy overhead. Marcus had been here only once before, for the funeral 37 years ago, but he remembered the way as if it were yesterday. Thomas Chen's gravestone was simple granite, worn smooth by decades of mountain weather. Elena knelt beside it, running her fingers over the carved letters of his name, while Marcus stood back, allowing her this moment of communion with her husband's memory. He never told me about the boy, she whispered. In all our years together, he never mentioned helping someone on the mountain. Maybe he didn't think it mattered, Marcus replied, though even as he spoke the words, he knew they weren't true. Nothing about that day had been insignificant. He was beginning to understand that now. Elena opened the envelope with trembling fingers, careful not to tear the aged paper. Inside were photographs, documents, and what appeared to be pages from a journal, all held together with a rubber band that crumbled at her touch. She lifted out the first photograph and gasped. It showed a young man in a business suit standing beside a newly purchased storefront, a sign above the door reading Chen Electronics. But it was the handwritten note on the back that made Marcus's breath catch. First store, purchased with mountain money. For the boy who shared his lunch. Mountain money? Elena looked up at him, confusion evident in her expression. Marcus took the photograph, studying Thomas's face, younger than he'd ever seen it, filled with hope and determination. What mountain money? Elena sorted through more photographs. Thomas with employees, receiving business awards, standing in front of increasingly larger storefronts. Each image was annotated in the same careful handwriting, creating a timeline of success that spanned decades. But it was the journal pages that revealed the truth Marcus had never suspected. Elena read aloud in a voice thick with emotion. The boy on the mountain gave me more than food that day. He gave me perspective. When I reached the city with empty pockets and no prospects, I remembered his generosity. How someone with so little could share without hesitation. I've been searching for him ever since. She turned the page. I started the business with money I found in my jacket pocket. Money I'm certain wasn't there before our encounter. 3 $20 bills, folded carefully in the inner pocket. I can only assume the boy placed them there somehow, though I cannot fathom how someone living in such poverty could possess such an amount. Marcus felt the ground shift beneath his feet. He remembered his grandmother's worried expression when she'd discovered the missing money from her emergency fund. He'd confessed eventually, accepting his punishment with the stoic resignation of a child who understood he'd done something wrong but not why it was wrong. The boy gave him $60, Marcus said quietly, money that didn't belong to him. Elena continued reading. I've hired investigators over the years, searched through school records, placed advertisements in local papers. The boy would be a man now, probably with a family of his own. I want him to know what his kindness accomplished. Every success I've achieved traces back to that moment on the mountain when a stranger chose compassion over self-preservation. The final pages detailed Thomas's illness and his growing urgency to complete his search. The handwriting became shakier, the entries shorter, until the last one, dated just 2 weeks before his death. Elena knows nothing of this quest. I fear I've waited too long, but someone must finish what I started. The debt remains unpaid. Marcus sank onto a nearby bench, overwhelmed by the weight of revelation. The successful businessman whose funeral he'd attended had built an empire on the foundation of a child's impulsive generosity. Thomas Chen hadn't just remembered that day, he'd carried it with him like a sacred trust, letting it shape every decision that followed. He found you, Elena said softly, joining him on the bench. Somehow, even after death, he found you. The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have as Marcus carried it back to his cabin. Inside, the deed to the Henderson property seemed to pulse with possibility, but doubt gnawed at him like a persistent ache. He'd spent the afternoon walking the familiar trails, trying to reconcile the boy he'd been with the man he'd become, and the stranger who claimed to bridge that gap. Sarah was waiting on his porch when he returned, her laptop balanced on her knees and a thermos of coffee steaming beside her. She looked up as his boots hit the wooden steps, her expression serious. I've been digging, she said without preamble. About your mysterious benefactor. Marcus settled into the chair beside her, grateful for her presence. Find anything? More than I expected. She turned the laptop toward him, revealing a newspaper article from 1987. The headline read, Local teen dies in mountain rescue attempt. Below it was a grainy photograph of a young man with kind eyes and Thomas's unmistakable smile. Marcus's breath caught. Michael Henderson. He was Thomas's older brother. Died trying to save 2 hikers caught in a blizzard up on Eagle's Peak, Sarah continued, scrolling through the article. He was 22, studying to be a teacher. The hikers survived, but Michael got trapped when an avalanche shifted the snowpack. The pieces began falling into place with painful clarity. Marcus remembered that winter, remembered how Thomas had withdrawn for months afterward, how the light in his eyes had dimmed. They'd been 15, too young to fully grasp the weight of such loss, but old enough to feel its impact. There's more, Sarah said softly. She pulled up another article, this one from 1989. Thomas left for college that fall, got a full scholarship to study engineering. But he never forgot where he came from. The screen showed a series of articles spanning decades. Thomas Henderson had built a successful construction company specializing in affordable housing for rural communities. He'd funded scholarship programs for mountain children, supported search and rescue operations, and quietly paid for medical expenses for families who couldn't afford them. He never married, Sarah noted, pointing to a brief biography piece. No children. Devoted his life to helping others, especially kids from backgrounds like his own. Marcus stared at the screen, seeing his childhood friend through new eyes. The shy boy who'd shared his lunch had grown into a man who'd made generosity his life's work. And somehow, across all those years, he'd remembered a simple gesture from a hungry classmate. The really interesting part, Sarah continued, is what happened near the end. Look at this. She showed him a legal document dated just 6 months ago. He established something called the Ripple Foundation. Its mission statement is beautiful, to demonstrate that small acts of kindness create endless waves of change. The foundation's assets were substantial. The Henderson property was just the beginning. There were funds for education, community development, and what the documents called kindness initiatives, programs designed to identify and support individuals who'd made positive impacts on their communities through simple acts of generosity. You weren't his only project, Marcus, Sarah explained. I found records of 12 other people across 4 states, a woman in Tennessee who'd given him directions when he was lost as a child, a gas station attendant in Kentucky who'd helped fix his family's car during a breakdown, a librarian in Virginia who'd let him keep books past their due dates because she knew he couldn't afford to buy them. Marcus felt tears threatening. He spent his life paying it forward. More than that. He spent it proving a point, that kindness matters, that it spreads, that a lunch shared between 2 hungry kids can somehow change the world. Sarah closed the laptop and took his hand. The question is, what are you going to do with this gift? Marcus looked out over the mountains, their peaks touched with the gold of approaching sunset. In the distance he could see the Henderson property, abandoned but full of potential. He thought about Thomas, about Michael, about all the lives that had been touched by simple acts of kindness rippling outward through time. I'm scared, he admitted. What if I can't live up to what he saw in me? What if I'm not the person he thought I was? You shared your lunch with a hungry kid, Sarah said simply. You've spent your life taking care of people in these mountains. You've been living up to it all along. A memory surfaced then, sharp and clear. The last day he'd seen Thomas right before his family moved away. They'd been sitting by the creek and Thomas had looked at him with those serious eyes and said, "Promise me you'll keep being kind, Marcus. Promise me you'll remember that it matters." He'd made that promise at 12 years old and somehow he'd kept it. Now Thomas was asking him to keep it on a larger scale, with greater resources, with the power to create ripples that might reach shores they couldn't even imagine. Marcus squeezed Sarah's hand, feeling the weight of possibility and responsibility settling on his shoulders like a familiar pack. "I think I know what I need to do," he said. The workshop fell silent except for the gentle hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Daniel stared at the photographs scattered across his workbench, each one telling a piece of a story he'd never known existed. His father, young and vibrant, standing beside men in military fatigues. His father receiving what looked like a commendation. His father's signature on documents bearing official seals. "I don't understand," Daniel whispered, picking up a black and white photograph of his father shaking hands with a man in uniform. He never served. He worked in the mines his whole life. Eleanor moved closer, her weathered fingers tracing the edge of another photograph. "Your father saved more than just my grandson that day on the mountain, Daniel. He saved something much bigger than any of us realized." Marcus stepped forward, his expression grave. "The man who was chasing me wasn't just any criminal. He was a foreign operative who'd stolen classified defense documents. When your father helped me escape and get those documents to safety, he became part of something that would echo through decades of international relations." Daniel's hands trembled as he continued examining the photographs. In one, he could see his father's young face, serious and determined. Nothing like the gentle, quiet man who had raised him. But why didn't he ever tell me? Why keep this secret? "Because he was protecting you," Eleanor said softly. "Just like he protected my grandson. Your father understood that some burdens are too heavy for the next generation to carry." A photograph near the bottom of the pile caught Daniel's attention. It showed his father standing in what appeared to be a government office, receiving a medal from a man whose face Daniel almost recognized from old history books. The date stamp read 1984, just months after that snowy encounter on the mountain. The documents Marcus carried contained information about a planned attack on a NATO facility, Eleanor continued, her voice heavy with the weight of old secrets. Your father's quick thinking and courage didn't just save one boy's life, it potentially saved hundreds of lives and prevented an international incident that could have escalated into something much worse. Marcus pulled out a leather folder from his coat. After that day, your father was contacted by government officials. They offered him recognition, money, even relocation to a safer place, but he turned it all down. He said he just wanted to go back to his life in the mountains, to his family. That sounds like him, Daniel murmured, remembering his father's simple philosophy about doing what was right without expecting anything in return. But the government didn't forget, Marcus continued, opening the folder to reveal more documents. They established a trust fund in his name, accruing interest for 40 years. They kept monitoring his family, ensuring your safety from a distance. When he passed away last year, the responsibility transferred to you. Daniel looked up sharply. What responsibility? Eleanor smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since she'd arrived. The responsibility to decide what to do with a considerable sum of money that was set aside for your family's service to the country. Money that could change not just your life, but the lives of everyone in this community. The numbers on the document seemed impossible to Daniel. More money than he'd ever imagined, sitting in accounts he'd never known existed, earning interest year after year, while his family had struggled to make ends meet. Your father knew about it, Marcus explained. He received annual statements but never touched a penny. He said the money felt too heavy, too connected to violence and politics. He wanted his family to earn their way through honest work. But he also knew, Eleanor added, that someday you might need it, not for personal gain but for something bigger. He left instructions that it should only be revealed to you when you demonstrated the same character he showed that day on the mountain. Daniel thought about the workshop around him, about the orders he couldn't fill, about Mrs. Peterson's table and the dozen other projects that represented his neighbor's trust in his craftsmanship. He thought about the younger families moving away because there weren't enough opportunities, about the school that needed repairs, about the community center that had been talking about improvements for years. The money comes with one condition, Marcus said, his voice gentle but firm. It has to be used to help others, the same way your father helped me. The government officials who established the trust were specific about that. Daniel set down the photographs and looked around his father's workshop with new eyes. The tools that had shaped countless pieces of furniture could be part of something larger. The skills his father had taught him could be the foundation for something that would honor both the simple act of kindness from 40 years ago and the complex legacy that had grown from it. What exactly are you asking me to do? He asked, though somewhere deep inside he already knew the answer. The old mining records sprawled across the kitchen table like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that had been scattered by wind. Thomas traced his finger along the faded property lines while Margaret poured coffee for their unexpected guests. The stranger, who called himself Daniel Hartwell, sat across from them, his expensive suit looking oddly out of place in their modest cabin. Your land extends much further than you realize, Daniel said, unfolding a survey map that crackled with age. When the mining company abandoned this area in 1954, they left behind more than just empty shafts. Thomas looked up from the documents, his weathered hands still trembling slightly from the shock of the past hour. This man claimed to represent the child he'd helped decades ago, the frightened boy he'd found lost in the mountains during that terrible storm in 1983. But the story Daniel told seemed impossible, like something from a fairy tale. I still don't understand, Margaret said, setting down steaming mugs. You're saying that boy Thomas helped become some kind of businessman? Daniel smiled, the expression transforming his stern features. Not just any businessman. Michael Chen built one of the largest tech companies on the West Coast. He never forgot the mountain boy who saved his life, who shared his meager supplies and guided him to safety. The memories came flooding back to Thomas, the terrified 8-year-old with the injured ankle, speaking broken English mixed with what he now knew was Mandarin. The child had been separated from his family during a hiking trip when the weather turned violent. Thomas, only 10 himself, had found the boy huddled beneath a rocky overhang, hypothermic and delirious with fear. "He searched for you," Daniel continued, spreading more papers across the table. "Hired investigators, checked school records, even had people canvass the entire mountain region. But Thomas Cooper is a common name, and you lived so far from civilization. We didn't even have a proper address back then," Thomas murmured, remembering their old shack that had been destroyed in the landslide of '91. "Just Route 2, Mountain View." "Exactly. It wasn't until last year, when the county digitized old mining claims, that we found the trail. Your property registration, filed when you built this cabin in '95, finally gave us what we needed." Margaret sank into her chair, studying the documents with growing amazement. "This geological survey, it says there could be rare earth deposits on our land?" Daniel nodded gravely. "The preliminary analysis suggests significant quantities of lithium, cobalt, and several other minerals essential for battery production. With the electric vehicle revolution, these deposits could be worth—" He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "Conservative estimates suggest somewhere between $50 and $80 million. The coffee mug slipped from Thomas's numb fingers, shattering against the floor. Margaret gasped, one hand flying to her mouth. The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled only by the distant sound of wind through the pines. "That's impossible," Thomas finally whispered. "Michael thought you might say that." Daniel reached into his briefcase and withdrew a tablet computer. The screen flickered to life, showing the face of a middle-aged Asian man in a wheelchair. Despite the years that had passed, Thomas recognized something familiar in the warm brown eyes. "Thomas?" The voice from the speakers was heavily accented but clear. "Is it really you?" Thomas leaned closer to the screen, his heart hammering. "Michael? Little Michael?" The man on the screen smiled, tears glistening in his eyes. "You remember me." "Of course I remember. You were so scared, so cold. Your ankle. You carried me on your back for 3 miles through the storm. You gave me half your food, even though you had so little. You probably saved my life." Margaret moved behind her husband's chair, her hands resting on his shoulders as she stared at the screen in wonder. "When I became successful," Michael continued, "I promised myself I would find you. I would repay your kindness somehow. The mining rights are just the beginning, Thomas. I want to establish a foundation in your name to help mountain communities like the one that shaped you into the person who saved a lost boy." Daniel cleared his throat softly. "There are legal documents to review, of course, environmental impact studies to complete, but Michael wanted me to give you this immediately." He slid a bank draft across the table. "Consider it a down payment on 40 years of gratitude." Thomas stared at the check, at the impossible number written in neat blue ink. $2 million. More money than he'd seen in his entire lifetime, more than he'd ever dreamed could exist in one place. "I don't understand," he said again, but his voice held wonder now instead of confusion. "Why? After all these years, why does it matter?" Michael's image on the screen seemed to glow with warmth. "Because kindness echoes, Thomas. You threw a stone into still water 40 years ago, and the ripples are just now reaching shore." The manila envelope felt heavier than it should have in Thomas's weathered hands. He sat at his kitchen table, the morning light streaming through windows that Sarah had helped him clean just days before. The coffee grew cold as he stared at the official letterhead, his name typed in precise black letters across the front. "Just open it already," he muttered to himself, but his fingers trembled as they worked along the sealed edge. The papers inside were thick, expensive-looking, legal documents with impressive seals and signatures he didn't recognize. Thomas adjusted his reading glasses and began to pass through the formal language, his brow furrowing deeper with each paragraph. The words seemed impossible. Transfer of ownership, Mountain Ridge Development Corporation, full title and deed, His eyes jumped to a figure at the bottom of the page that made his heart skip, not just his small plot of land, but the entire mountainside, hundreds of acres that had been quietly purchased over the years by various shell companies, all apparently controlled by the same mysterious benefactor. A knock at the door interrupted his shock. Through the window he could see Sarah's concerned face peering in. "Come in! It's open!" he called, his voice hoarse. Sarah entered, immediately sensing something had shifted. "Thomas, you look like you've seen a ghost." He held up the papers with shaking hands. "I think maybe I have." She crossed the room quickly, settling into the chair beside him. "What is it?" "Sarah, this man, Marcus. He's given me the entire mountain, not just my land, but everything. The development rights, the mineral rights, all of it." Thomas's voice cracked. "Says here it's worth more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. Sarah's eyes widened as she scanned the documents. "But why? I mean, I know you helped him when he was a boy, but this—" She gestured at the papers. "This is enormous." Thomas rose slowly and walked to the window that faced the trail where he'd first encountered that scared, hungry child all those years ago. "You know what the strangest part is? I barely remember that day. It was just what you do. Kid was cold and scared, so you help. Never thought twice about it." "Maybe that's exactly why," Sarah said softly. "Maybe because it was so natural to you, so effortless, that it meant everything to him." The sound of an engine echoed up the mountain road. Both of them turned toward the window as Marcus's rental car came into view. Thomas felt his pulse quicken. There were still so many questions, so many pieces that didn't quite fit together. Marcus climbed the steps to the porch, his expression unreadable. When Thomas opened the door, he could see something had changed in the man's demeanor overnight. The careful composure was still there, but underneath it was something raw, vulnerable. "I wondered if you'd had a chance to review the paperwork," Marcus said, his voice quieter than usual. "I'm still trying to understand it," Thomas replied, stepping aside to let him enter. "Marcus, I can't accept this. It's too much, way too much." Marcus shook his head firmly. "Mr. Chen, you don't understand. That winter, when you found me on this mountain, I was running away from a foster home that was—" He paused, struggling with the words. "Let's just say it wasn't safe. I had nowhere to go. It was getting dark, starting to snow, and I was lost." Sarah remained quietly in her chair, recognizing the weight of the moment. "If you hadn't found me, hadn't brought me to your cabin, fed me, let me sleep by your fire, I would have died on this mountain that night." Marcus's voice was steady now, but Thomas could see the emotion in his eyes. "Instead, you saved my life, and the next morning when you walked me down to the main road, you gave me $20 and told me that sometimes the bravest thing is asking for help." Thomas sank into his chair, the memory slowly crystallizing. A thin boy with frightened eyes and clothes too small for his growing frame. "I remember now," he whispered. "You said you were heading to California." "I was, and I made it, eventually. Ended up in a good home with people who cared, went to school, started a business, built a life." Marcus sat down across from them. "But I never forgot the man who showed me that strangers could be kind, that the world wasn't entirely cold and cruel." $20, Thomas said, shaking his head in wonder. $20 and a lesson that shaped everything I became. Marcus leaned forward. "Mr. Chen, I've spent 30 years trying to figure out how to repay a debt that can't be repaid. This mountain, this gift, it's not charity. It's just interest on what you gave me that night." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of time and the strange mathematics of kindness compound over decades. The old mining office felt smaller with all of them gathered inside, but Marcus insisted they needed privacy for what he was about to reveal. Elena watched her father's weathered hands shake slightly as he cleared papers from the desk, making room for the leather portfolio Marcus had carried with him. "Before I show you what's inside here," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, I need you to understand something about your kindness that day, Thomas. You gave me more than food and shelter. Thomas shifted uncomfortably in his chair, still struggling with the idea that his simple gesture had somehow led to this moment. I just did what anyone would do. No, Marcus said firmly. What you did was see me as human when others saw me as a burden. That made all the difference. Marcus opened the portfolio, revealing a stack of documents that looked official and important. Elena leaned forward, trying to read the letterhead on the top page, but the angle made it impossible. After I left these mountains, Marcus continued, I spent 2 years in foster care. Good people, but I never forgot where I came from or what you taught me about helping others. When I aged out of the system, I used every resource available to get an education. He pulled out a photograph from the portfolio. A much younger Marcus in a graduation cap and gown, standing beside an older couple who must have been his foster parents. Engineering degree from Virginia Tech, he said with quiet pride. Full scholarship. But even then I knew I'd come back someday. This place gets in your blood. James spoke up from his corner of the room. That's quite an achievement, but I'm still not understanding why you're here now with all this. He gestured at the documents. Marcus smiled, the expression transforming his face. Because Thomas gave me something to come back for. He showed me that there were good people in these mountains, people worth fighting for. He pulled out a larger document, unfolding it carefully on the desk. Elena gasped as she recognized what it was. A geological survey map of the entire valley, marked with various symbols and notations. I've spent the last 15 years working for energy companies, specializing in sustainable resource development, Marcus explained. 3 years ago, I started my own consulting firm. We focus on helping communities transition from traditional mining to renewable energy projects. Thomas studied the map, his finger tracing the familiar ridgelines. What are all these marks? Optimal locations for wind farms and solar installations, Marcus said. This entire valley has incredible potential for clean energy production. The elevation, the wind patterns, the sun exposure, it's perfect. Elena felt her heart begin to race as the implications became clear. You're talking about bringing jobs back to the valley? Not just jobs, Marcus said, pulling out another set of documents. I'm talking about making this community a partner in the project. Full profit-sharing agreements, local hiring preferences, environmental restoration funding. He spread out an artist's rendering that showed the valley transformed but not destroyed. Wind turbines following the natural ridgelines, solar panels integrated thoughtfully into the landscape, and what looked like a modern visitor center built near the old mining site. The preliminary estimates suggest this project could provide steady employment for over 200 people, Marcus continued. Construction jobs first, then permanent positions for maintenance, monitoring, and administration. Plus the Community Development Fund would support education and infrastructure improvements. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, studying the plans. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. You're offering us hope. I'm offering you a partnership, Marcus corrected. But there's a condition. The room fell silent. Elena felt the familiar weight of disappointment settling over her shoulders. There was always a catch, always something too good to be true. The condition is that the community has to want this, Marcus said, not just tolerate it, but actively embrace it. This only works if people here become stakeholders, not just employees, if they help shape the project from the beginning. James frowned. That's your condition? That we actually participate? Change imposed from the outside never lasts, Marcus explained. I learned that from watching what happened to these mining towns. People need ownership, need to feel like they're building something rather than just watching it happen to them. Elena looked at her father, seeing something in his expression she hadn't seen in years. Genuine excitement mixed with cautious hope. There's something else, Marcus added, reaching into the portfolio one more time. He pulled out a single sheet of paper, handing it directly to Thomas. The first facility we build will be the Thomas Mitchell Community Learning Center, fully funded, designed to provide job training and continuing education for anyone in the valley who wants it. Thomas stared at the paper, his hands trembling. Elena moved to his side, reading over his shoulder. It was a formal commitment letter, signed and notarized, guaranteeing funding for $1 million educational facility. The morning sun cast long shadows through the forest as Marcus led them deeper into the mountains along a path only he remembered. Sarah walked beside him, her hand occasionally brushing his as they navigated the rocky terrain. Behind them, Elena clutched the worn leather journal against her chest while Thomas brought up the rear. His expensive shoes clearly not designed for this terrain. "Are you certain this is the right way?" Thomas called out, breathing heavily. "We've been walking for over an hour." Marcus paused at a familiar bend in the trail where an ancient oak had fallen decades ago, now serving as a natural bridge across a small ravine. "Some things can't be rushed," he said, helping Sarah across the weathered trunk. "My grandfather always said the mountain reveals its secrets when you're ready, not when you're in a hurry." Elena smiled at this, remembering the stories her father used to tell about patience and timing. She followed Marcus's careful footsteps across the log, Thomas grudgingly accepting help from Sarah on the other side. The path grew steeper, winding through stands of pine and maple that Marcus remembered climbing as a boy. Every turn brought back memories: the place where he'd caught his first trout, the clearing where his grandfather had taught him to identify edible plants, the rocky outcrop where they'd watched storms roll across the valley. "There," Marcus said suddenly, pointing ahead to where the trees thinned. "The cabin should be just beyond that ridge." But when they crested the hill, they found only a foundation of stacked stones, partially hidden by decades of undergrowth. Where his grandfather's cabin once stood, nature had reclaimed the land. Wildflowers grew between the foundation stones, and young saplings pushed up through what had once been the main room. Sarah squeezed Marcus's arm gently. "I'm sorry. I know this must be difficult." Marcus stood quietly for a moment, processing the sight. He'd known intellectually that the cabin would be gone. 40 years was a long time for an abandoned mountain dwelling, but seeing the reality still hit him harder than expected. "Actually," he said, kneeling to brush leaves away from a familiar stone, "this is exactly right. Grandfather always said he wanted to return to the earth when his time was done. Looks like the cabin beat him to it." Elena opened the journal, her fingers finding a specific entry. "Your grandfather wrote something here about the land remembering even when buildings forget. He said the important things get preserved in different ways." Thomas, who had been unusually quiet during the hike, surprised them all by asking, "Where did you keep the kindling?" In the story Elena told, you gathered wood for the fire the night her father stayed here. Marcus walked to what had been the back corner of the cabin, where a large boulder provided natural shelter. Behind it, partially concealed by ferns, they could see the remnants of a stone-lined fire pit. "Grandfather built that fire ring away from the cabin," Marcus explained. "Said it was safer, especially during dry spells. We kept the kindling in a wooden box right about here." He gestured to a spot near the boulder where the outline of a rectangular depression was still visible in the earth. Elena approached the fire pit reverently, imagining her father sitting here all those years ago, a young man fleeing a life that had become unbearable. "He wrote that this place saved him," she said softly. "Not just the shelter, but the kindness. He said it reminded him that good people still existed in the world." Sarah wandered toward the edge of the clearing, where the mountain dropped away into a spectacular view of the valley below. "I can see why your grandfather chose this spot. It's beautiful up here." Marcus joined her at the overlook. The view had changed over the decades. The valley showed more development now, roads where there had once been only forest paths, but the essential beauty remained. The winding river still caught the sunlight like scattered diamonds, and the distant mountains still rose in blue-hazed layers toward the horizon. He used to say this view reminded him that problems always look smaller when you get enough distance from them, Marcus said. Perspective, he called it. Said most folks spent so much time looking at their feet they forgot to look up. Thomas had found a flat stone near the foundation and sat down heavily, pulling out a handkerchief to wipe his forehead. I have to admit, I didn't understand why we needed to make this trip. It seemed like unnecessary sentiment, but being here—" He trailed off, looking around at the peaceful clearing. "There's something about this place." Elena closed the journal and looked at each of them in turn. "My father's last entry about this place was written just before he died. He said he hoped someday I'd find my way back here, and that when I did, I'd understand what he learned that night." "What was that?" Sarah asked. "That kindness isn't something you do once and forget. It plants seeds that keep growing, even after you think the story is over." The morning mist clung to the mountainside as Thomas walked the familiar path one last time before the construction crews arrived. In 3 days, the bulldozers would begin carving the road that would connect his remote valley to the outside world. The irony wasn't lost on him that the very isolation which had shaped his character and led to that fateful encounter with Sarah 40 years ago would soon be erased forever. Sarah had returned to the city 2 weeks earlier to finalize the legal documents for the Scholarship Foundation, but her presence still lingered in every corner of the small cabin. The signed contracts lay neatly stacked on his kitchen table, each page representing a future he'd never dared imagine. The Thomas McKinley Foundation for Rural Youth would ensure that children from remote mountain communities would have opportunities he'd only dreamed of as a boy. A knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Thomas opened it to find Marcus, Sarah's son, holding a worn leather satchel and wearing an expression of barely contained excitement. "I thought you'd left with your mother," Thomas said, stepping aside to let him in. "I stayed behind to finish something." Marcus set the satchel on the table beside the legal papers. "Remember when Mom told you about the butterfly effect? How one small action can change everything?" Thomas nodded, settling into his chair. Over the past month, he'd grown fond of this young man who possessed his mother's intelligence, but tempered it with a gentle curiosity that reminded Thomas of his younger self. "Well, I've been researching the children who received your help over the years." Marcus opened the satchel and began pulling out folders. It started as a way to understand the impact of the foundation, but it became something much bigger. The first folder contained a photograph of Emma Rodriguez, the girl whose family Thomas had helped during the harsh winter of 1995. She was now Dr. Emma Rodriguez Chen, Chief of Pediatric Surgery at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. "She credits you with saving her brother's life when he had pneumonia," Marcus said. "But more than that, your kindness inspired her to pursue medicine. She's performed over 3,000 life-saving surgeries." Thomas stared at the photograph, remembering the frightened 8-year-old who'd knocked on his door during a blizzard, begging for help when her little brother couldn't breathe. The next folder revealed the story of David Park, the Korean War veteran's grandson, whom Thomas had taught to read in the late 1980s. David had become a literacy advocate, establishing reading programs across Appalachia that had helped over 50,000 children. "He never forgot the man who showed him that books could be doorways to other worlds," Marcus continued. Folder after folder revealed lives transformed. Teachers, doctors, engineers, artists, and community leaders, all connected by threads leading back to Thomas's small acts of compassion. Each story rippled outward, touching more lives, creating an ever-expanding web of positive change. "This is impossible," Thomas whispered, overwhelmed by the scope of what Marcus had uncovered. "I was just trying to help people." "That's exactly the point." Marcus pulled out the final folder, this one thicker than all the others. "My mother's encounter with you in 1983 wasn't the beginning, Thomas. It was just one note in a symphony you'd been composing your entire life." The last folder contained letters, hundreds of them. Some were addressed directly to Thomas, others to local churches and community centers where people had hoped to reach him. Thank you notes spanning 4 decades, many from people he barely remembered helping. One letter, dated just 6 months earlier, caught his attention. It was from Jennifer Hayes, the daughter of a family he'd helped after a mine collapse in 1978. She was now a state senator working on education reform. We're tracking over 200,000 lives directly impacted by your actions, Marcus said quietly. And that's just what we can document. The actual number is certainly much higher. Thomas set down the letter, his hands trembling slightly. I never knew. How could you? You never stuck around for the gratitude. You just helped and moved on. Marcus smiled. But here's the most beautiful part. Almost every person we contacted wants to contribute to the foundation. Not just money, but time, expertise, networks. You've accidentally built the most powerful force for good this region has ever seen. Through the window, Thomas could see the survey stakes marking where the new road would run. Soon this isolated valley would be connected to the wider world, just as these folders had connected him to the vast network of lives he'd touched. What happens now? He asked. Marcus grinned, looking more like his mother than ever. Now we stop calling it an accident. The foundation officially launches next month, and you're going to help us coordinate the largest rural education initiative in American history. Thomas looked again at the photographs and letters spread across his table. Somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of approaching vehicles, the survey crew arriving early to begin their work. The mountain was changing, just like everything else. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Thomas stood at his cabin window, watching Marcus prepare for his departure. The sleek black sedan looked out of place against the backdrop of weathered barnwood and mountain stone, like a piece of the future that had somehow wandered into the past. You don't have to go, Thomas said, though he knew the words were futile. They'd talked through the night, and Marcus had made his decision clear. Marcus turned from loading his suitcase, his expression gentle but resolute. The foundation won't run itself, and there are board meetings that have been postponed too long already. But this isn't goodbye, Thomas. Not anymore. Sarah emerged from the house carrying a thermos and a paper bag. Coffee for the road, she said, pressing them into Marcus's hands. And some of those biscuits you couldn't stop eating at breakfast. Marcus accepted the offerings with a smile that transformed his face, erasing decades of corporate stoicism. You've spoiled me. I don't know how I'm going to explain to my cook that mountain biscuits have ruined me for everything else. Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a loosening of tension he'd carried for so long he'd forgotten it was there. The easy banter between his wife and his childhood friend felt natural, as if the intervening 40 years had been nothing more than a long winter that was finally giving way to spring. Before you leave, Thomas said, reaching into his pocket, I want you to have something. He pulled out a small object wrapped in faded cloth. Marcus recognized the fabric immediately. It was a piece of the old quilt that had covered Thomas's bed all those years ago. With careful fingers, Marcus unwrapped it to reveal a smooth river stone, no bigger than a silver dollar, with a natural hole worn through its center. I found that the day after you left, Thomas explained, down by the creek where we used to skip stones. My grandmother always said rocks with holes like that were special. They could see through time, connect past and future. I've carried it ever since, thinking about you, wondering where life had taken you. Marcus held the stone up to the morning light, peering through the small aperture. For a moment, he could almost see them as boys again, splashing in the cold mountain water, their laughter echoing off the valley walls. The foundation's expanding, Marcus said suddenly, lowering the stone. We're looking at rural development projects, sustainable community programs. Places like this valley, Thomas raised an eyebrow. Is that so? There's a growing understanding that preserving traditional ways of life and protecting natural resources go hand in hand. Communities that have lived in harmony with their environment for generations often have wisdom that modern development has forgotten. Sarah stepped closer to her husband, slipping her arm through his. That sounds like something we might be interested in learning more about. Good, Marcus said, pocketing the stone carefully. Because I was hoping you'd consider being a consultant. The foundation could use someone who understands both the land and the people who live on it. Thomas felt the world expanding around him in ways he'd never imagined. For so long, his life had been bounded by the valley's ridges, defined by the familiar rhythms of seasons and the steady satisfaction of work done with his hands. Now possibilities stretched out like mountain vistas revealed after a long climb. "You're offering me a job?" Thomas asked. "I'm offering you a partnership," Marcus corrected. "A chance to help other communities like this one thrive without losing what makes them special. Your insights would be invaluable." The sound of gravel crunching under tires interrupted their conversation. A pickup truck was making its way up the drive, and Thomas recognized it immediately as belonging to his neighbor, Jim Morrison. "Expecting company?" Marcus asked. Thomas shook his head, but he wasn't concerned. Neighbors dropping by unannounced was as natural as sunrise in these mountains. Jim parked and climbed out, his weathered face creased with curiosity as he took in the expensive sedan. "Morning, folks," Jim called out, touching the brim of his cap to Sarah. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important." "Just saying goodbye to an old friend," Thomas replied. "Jim Morrison, meet Marcus Whitfield." Jim's eyes widened slightly at the name. Even in their remote valley, the Whitfield Foundation's reputation had reached them. He stepped forward and extended a calloused hand, which Marcus shook warmly. "Mr. Whitfield," Jim said, "heard you've been visiting. Word travels fast around here." Marcus glanced at Thomas with amusement. "I'm learning that. Jim here runs the finest cattle operation in 3 counties, Thomas said. Sustainable practices his family's been using for 4 generations. The businessman in Marcus immediately perked up. "I'd love to hear about that sometime." As the 3 men talked, Sarah noticed how naturally Marcus fit into their world now, how the rigid formality of his arrival had given way to genuine interest and warmth. The mountains, it seemed, had worked their quiet magic once again. The morning sun cast long shadows across the valley as Thomas walked the familiar mountain path one last time before heading back to the city. In his jacket pocket, the deed to the new community center felt warm against his chest, a tangible reminder that yesterday's ceremony had been real, not just another dream about roads not taken. Behind him, footsteps crunched on the frost-covered leaves. He turned to find Elena approaching, her breath visible in the crisp air, carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee from the diner. "Thought you might need this before your drive," she said, offering him one of the cups. "It's a long way back to Philadelphia." Thomas accepted the coffee gratefully, wrapping his fingers around the warmth. "I keep thinking I should stay longer. Make sure everything gets started properly. The center will be fine. Mrs. Henderson has already volunteered to coordinate the after-school programs, and Doc Martinez wants to set up health screenings for the elderly." Elena smiled. "This town has been waiting 40 years to properly thank you. We're not going to let you down now." They walked together toward the overlook where Thomas had first met the mysterious stranger who had changed everything. The valley spread below them, the small town looking peaceful and timeless in the morning light. Smoke rose from chimneys, and Thomas could see children walking to school, their laughter echoing faintly across the distance. "I never told you the whole story about that day," Thomas said quietly. "When I gave Margaret those boots," Elena settled beside him on the old wooden bench someone had built at the overlook years ago. "What do you mean?" "I was supposed to go to town with my father that morning. He was going to introduce me to his friend who worked at the lumber mill, said maybe I could get a job there when I finished school." Thomas took a sip of coffee, the memory as clear as yesterday. "But when I saw that girl walking barefoot in the snow, I couldn't just watch. I gave her my boots and missed the trip entirely. And the job? Gone by the time my father could arrange another meeting. The position had been filled." Thomas shook his head at the irony. "I was so angry at the time. Thought I'd ruined my only chance to escape this place." Elena was quiet for a moment. "But you found another way." "Eventually. Got a scholarship to Penn State because I spent that winter studying instead of working at the mill. Funny how life works. What felt like the worst luck turned out to be the best thing that could have happened to me." A hawk circled overhead, riding the mountain thermals with effortless grace. Thomas watched it soar, thinking about the stranger who had appeared 6 months ago with Margaret's letter and the shocking revelation of her identity. Margaret Chen, the little girl with no shoes, had become one of the most successful technology entrepreneurs in the country. Her letter, written just before her death, had detailed how that simple act of kindness had changed the trajectory of her entire life. She wrote that she never forgot the boy who gave her his boots. Thomas continued, said it taught her that strangers could show kindness for no reason except that it was right. That lesson shaped how she ran her companies, how she treated her employees, how she lived her life. Elena reached over and took his hand. And now her foundation is funding the community center. $20 million, Thomas said, still amazed by the figure. All because a poor mountain kid couldn't stand to see someone suffer. You could have kept the money for yourself. She left that option open in the letter. Thomas squeezed Elena's hand gently. What would I do with $20 million that would matter as much as this? The center will serve these mountains for generations. Kids like I was will have a place to study, to dream, to believe they can become something more. They sat in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher, warming the air and melting the frost from the nearby pine needles. Thomas felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a deep sense of completion, as if a circle begun 40 years ago had finally closed. I have something to ask you, Elena said suddenly, her voice nervous. I know you have your life in Philadelphia, your practice, your reputation, but we're going to need a board chairman for the community center, someone who understands both where we came from and where we're going. Thomas looked at her, seeing not just the invitation to serve on a board, but something deeper, a chance to come home, to be part of something meaningful in the place where his story began. Are you asking me to move back to these mountains? I'm asking if you think an old community might have room for a successful lawyer who still remembers what it's like to have snow between his toes. Thomas smiled, watching the hawk disappear over the ridge toward whatever adventure awaited beyond the horizon.